terrorists. They came out of the evangelical movements first, and they were very brave and courageous people. I still meet them all over Central America and other places, and they've now extended to the Middle East, and Rachel Corrie's group is one of the outgrowths of that. And that's just that's just on the surface. If you take a look at the global justice movements, the movements that are called, it's a ridiculous term, but are called anti-globalization movements in the propaganda system, basically global justice movements. I mean, they are really inspired and to a large extent led by young people all over the place. In the rest of the world too. The United States is there's a reason why the meetings of the World Social Forum, the main grouping of these, are in Brazil and now in India. The reason is that the impetus for it primarily comes from the South, but the North has joined in, and that's significant. It's an international movement with plenty of young people. The same's true of environmental movements and lots, anti-sweatshop movements and lots of others. So they're all over the place.
Thank you.
Hi. I'd also like to thank you for coming to speak here and congratulate you on the lack of pro-Zionist protesters at this particular event. It was my understanding that was a regular facet of a Noam Chomsky speech, and I was surprised, almost a little disappointed. But I have about 1 billion questions I want to ask, but in the interest of time, I'll just stick to the one that has been sort of foremost on my mind. When this war began, I had heard rumors, which I was not able to find any hard evidence on, that supposedly France's opposition was based on some sort of fear that any weapons we find might be linked to them, which
France's fear? Whose fear? France?
France's, yes. I couldn't find any evidence on this, and this doesn't make any sense to me personally, because if anything, I would think they would want us to stop snooping around Iraq and start bombing them if this was true. But it did raise a question in my mind of what exactly France's opposition was linked in, because I guess recent events have sort of jaded me to the point where I don't really expect to find a government administration, really opposing a war for moral reasons. So I was wondering if you knew if there was any sort of self-interest involved.
Oh, there was self-interest, all right. I mean, France had, as far as weapons of mass destruction are concerned, they would have been found from everywhere, including the United States. The U.S. was providing Saddam Hussein with dual-use technology, which could be used and was used to develop weapons of mass destruction, right up to the day of the invasion of Kuwait. The British were a little slow on the draw, and they kept providing them even a couple of days later. And this was long after Saddam Hussein's worst atrocities were perfectly well known. It was long after the war with Iran. It had nothing to do with Iran. In fact, the Bush #1 administration announced quite publicly why they were doing it. It wasn't reported, but they announced it. They said we're doing it for two reasons. First of all, it's our responsibility to assist U.S. exporters. And secondly, providing aid, including military aid to Saddam Hussein, will improve the human rights situation and improve the stability of the region. It's on the public record. The Iraqi, you remember last December 8th, I think, Iraq provided some huge document to the United Nations, sort of supposedly describing all of its weapons of mass destruction programs, big event. The U.S., if you recall, stole that document before it was distributed to the United Nations and edited it, and then provided it to the permanent members, but kept it away, theoretically, but kept it away from the other members. And according to many credible reports, including Dilip Hero's book, which I just mentioned, apparently they edited out of it material which was circulated in the European press about the role of U.S. corporations in supporting Saddam Hussein's weapons programs right up to the last minute. So yeah, you'd probably find French weapons and German weapons and Russian weapons and U.S. weapons and, everybody. During the period of Saddam Hussein's worst atrocities, the gassing of the Kurds and all that, everybody was trying to get a piece of the action to make some money out of it. And so yes, you'd find all of those. As far as France is concerned, they also, like the United States and Russia and others, were making various deals with Iraq in one fashion or another to use Iraqi oil. I think the U.S. was actually probably the major importer of Iraqi oil in the 90s through Dick Cheney's Halliburton under various covers. So you find all sorts of things. You're right that France, like anyone else, is no system of power. Systems of power are not moral agents. States are not moral agents any more than businesses are. They act out of the interests that they represent. People are moral agents. Institutions aren't. So yeah, France isn't doing it out of the goodness of their heart, but for whatever motives they had. However, it is striking, and we ought to think about this, it's striking how the question arises in the United States. The question that constantly arises is why France, Germany, Turkey, and so on didn't go along with the United States. What was their hidden motive? Actually, it's a curious question, because the fact of the matter is that there was just about nowhere in the world where there was more than maybe 10% support for the U.S. invasion. Now, that was shown in Gallup polls last December, which were never published, but they're there. You can find them. No country polled around the world, I think, did they get more support than 10%. So the only difference among countries was, would the government go along with the vast majority of the population, or wouldn't they? And it's very striking to see the way that cut was made. You recall the discussion about old Europe and new Europe. Old Europe, the bad guys, were supposed to hate France and Germany, wonder what kind of cynical things they're up to. The good guys are Berlusconi in Italy and Aznar in Spain and Hungary and Latvia, who went along with the United States. They're the good guys. Hope for the future. Well, what was the criterion that distinguished the good guys from the bad guys? It's very straightforward. The bad guys, like France and Germany, the governments went along with a large majority of the population. The good guys, like Berlusconi and Aznar, opposed the will of an even greater majority of the population and took their orders from Crawford, Texas. So they're the hope for democracy. The most striking example was Turkey and Paul Wolfowitz, who's the great visionary who everyone's supposed to revere for his love of democracy. In Turkey, 95% of the population were opposed to participating in the invasion. And to everybody's surprise, the government actually went along with them. And they were bitterly denounced. I mean, Colin Powell immediately announced they were going to be punished. Editorials were denouncing Turkey literally for its lack of democratic credentials, literally, because the government was going along with 95% of the population. Paul Wolfowitz, the great visionary, publicly condemned the Turkish military because they didn't intervene to prevent the government from this sin, namely going along with 95% of the population. And he ordered them that they said, you're going to have to apologize to the United States for this and not recognize that it's your duty to help Americans. He's the visionary who's leading the struggle to bring democracy to the Middle East. In fact, I cannot think, try the experiment, and see if you can ever find anywhere in history such an exhibition of brazen, open contempt and hatred for democracy as in this entire display about old Europe, new Europe, Turkey, and so on. I mean, the good guys, like the old Russian satellites, they were obedient. They overruled a huge majority of the population, way more than France and Spain and Germany. And in fact, some of them even talked about it. The foreign minister of Latvia was asked why they went along with the United States, even though the population was overwhelmingly opposed. And he said, look, we know you have to say yes, sir, and obey the Americans. understand that from a long history as Soviet satellites, and they still understand it, so they're the hope for democracy. This display is quite astonishing, and it's part of the reason why outside of U.S. editorial writers and commentators and U.S. intellectuals, nobody takes the democracy rhetoric seriously. It's not the only reason, but it's a part of the reason. I mean, that's not ancient history. That's just a couple of months ago. Incidentally, there are other reasons for this, like take the Middle East. In the whole Middle East region, there's one elected leader. One. Elected in reasonably fair elections. Yasser Arafat. Okay. The United States decided that they want to get rid of him. He wasn't doing his job of controlling the population the way he's supposed to. So right in the middle of all the democracy rhetoric, the Bush administration announced that Arafat's got to go, and instead they want Mahmoud Abbas. I mean, the press reported it. They also pointed out correctly that Abbas had no popular support, and Arafat was the elected leader the only leader who had a lot of support. But that never, you try to find anyone who said, okay, that illustrates that we're not supporting democracy. No, that illustrates that we're supporting democracy because we think Mahmoud Abbas will follow our orders, and Arafat doesn't seem to be doing it. So therefore it supports democracy to either kill or expel or suppress the only elected leader in the Middle East. How can you expect people there to take the rhetoric seriously? On the other hand, if you take a look at Bush's last speech about bringing democracy to the Middle East, and this is discussed in Middle East journals. You take a look at the countries he praised and the countries for advancing towards democracy and the ones that he condemned. It had nothing to do with their attitude toward democracy. It had to do with whether they were following U.S. orders. No matter how brutal they were, how many people were being tortured in jail or anything else, or which direction things were going, if they were following U.S. orders, they were advancing toward democracy. You think people don't notice that in the Middle East or anywhere? Yeah, they notice it. I mean, it may not make the editorials and the commentaries and the journals and probably the classrooms here, but people who don't have the luxury of ignoring the world, they notice it. Takes a little effort not to see it.
Hi. My question is kind of directed towards the educational system in America and minorities. There seems to be an ongoing procedure to keep blacks especially uneducated so that, one, they're more vulnerable to being manipulated, and two, so that the American public believes they are the cause for a lot of crime and such. And also how the CIA is the main reason why the crack explosion of the 1980s took place. What do you think can be done to kind of make this aware to this huge population of minorities, and to kind of work so that the educational system is, especially the public system in inner cities, is improved?
Well, I don't really think the CIA was involved in the crack epidemic. I'm skeptical about that, but the rest of what you said I think is not only true, but very dramatically and significantly true. In fact, the point isn't so much to keep the black population uneducated as to keep them in jail, especially black males. So since around 1980, if you go back to 1980, the prison population in the United States was, relative to population, was approximately the same as other industrial societies. By now, it's about 5 to 10 times as high as other industrial societies. Crime hasn't increased. In fact, it's decreased. Furthermore, crime in the United States is not particularly high as compared with comparable societies. It's within the spectrum of other industrial societies. But fear of crime is way beyond other societies. Same is true of drugs. Drug use is around the same as elsewhere. Fear of drugs is far beyond anyone else. It's very much like fear of Iraq. It's just unique in the United States. And this happens to be a very frightened society in many respects. It goes way back. I mean, when my kids were in school back around 1960, they were literally being taught to hide under desks to protect them from atom bomb attacks. I mean, aside from the idiocy of it, this was a technique to frighten them, and kids were afraid. I mean, children of friends of mine were contemplating suicide in the 60s because we're going to be attacked by the Red Chinese any minute with atom bombs. What's the point of doing anything? Fear of aliens is very high in the United States. Around half the population thinks there are aliens among us, and they have duck people and things like that. Nobody believes this anywhere. Right through the 80s, remember the current administration in Washington, those are the guys who were running the country from 1981 to 1992. They're basically recycled from the Reagan and Bush 1 administration. They had people terrified of everything. I mean, the United States was afraid of Grenada. You know, you can't find it. I mean, it's 100,000 people on a tiny, the nutmeg capital of the world. But Reagan invaded it, and afterwards made a speech about how we're standing tall. You know, we succeeded in overcoming Grenada and protecting ourselves from an air base that the Russians were going to use if they could find it on a map to attack us. And that was taken seriously. I mean, in 1985, Reagan declared a national emergency in the United States because of the unusual and extraordinary threat to American security, U.S. security, posed by the government of Nicaragua, which was only 2 days driving time from Harlingen, Texas. You know, we had to tremble in fear before Nicaragua. Yeah, I mean, around the world, people couldn't figure out what's going on, you know. But it happened, and that's the way they held power for 12 years, pushing the panic button every year or so. Either it was Grenada or Nicaragua or Libya or crime in the streets or black criminals or so on. I mean, those of you who are old enough will remember how George Bush #1 won the 1988 election, playing a straight race card. You know, black criminals are going to rape your sister unless you vote for me. Willie Horton. That's what pushed him up in the polls. So it's real. The whole drug war, so-called, is a complete scam. I mean, it was, and it's known to be. It has almost nothing to do with ameliorating whatever problem drugs cause, and it's a problem, as in other countries. Everyone knows, and it's well known, there are very good studies showing that the most cost-effective way to deal with this by far is prevention and treatment. And that's barely funded. Actually, the last president who was really funding that was Richard Nixon, you know, the last liberal president, believe it or not. Now it's punishment. You know, punishment here, border controls, bombing, you know, fuming chemical warfare in the Andes, all of which are known to have almost no effect on drug use, very limited. But they have other purposes, and one of them domestically is what you said. It's a kind of a counterinsurgency program against superfluous people. The poor, race and class tend to be fairly closely correlated in the United States, so it ends up being mostly blacks, secondarily Latinos. It's just getting rid of poor people who don't have any, we have no use for the rich and privileged. And the way you do it here is toss them in jail. And it continues to go up. I mean, it's not Republicans. I mean, Clinton increased the prison population by roughly 50%, mostly black males, secondarily Latino males by now, women too, and a tremendous percentage of them on victimless crimes, meaning, you know, kids caught with a joint or something like that. And that's very class-based. I mean, you know, the police can go into Roxbury and arrest some kid who has a joint in his pocket, but they can't, where I live in Lexington, you know, upper middle class suburb, the police can't go into somebody's home and, you know, or find them in the street, some executive who's going home to snort cocaine in the evening. You can't do that. If they try that, they'll be in jail, not the guy they're going after. In Roxbury, they can do it. And in fact, if you take a look at, I mean, I should say, let me just, all right, I'll go on with this if you like, but go ahead with your question. There's a lot more to say about
but
it.
since education is the most important tool, obviously, is how we're learning this, what is your suggestion to improving the education?
Tell people, children should be taught the truth. Like you said, it's a simple value. I mean, there's the truth about these things is not very obscure. You can read it in any criminology book. Nobody doubts it very much. The things I've just said are, they're not obscure. They're well known. There's a lot more like it, and that's what people should understand. It's correct to teach children that they shouldn't use drugs. It's harmful. Tobacco is even more harmful. Alcohol's probably even more harmful. Red meat is harmful. Coffee is harmful. There's a lot of things that are harmful, and people should know about that. And in fact, if you look back at the timing of the Bush administration's drug war, 1989 they launched the drug war. If you took a look at trends in statistical trends in the population, they were very dramatic. Through the peak use of marijuana was around, I think, 1979, but that was also a low point of criminalization. It was technically illegal, but very few people were arrested for it. The reason is they were people like you. They were students in colleges. You don't go after them. Through the 1980s, there was a decline in use of just about anything among educated and wealthier people. So there was a decline in smoking, in drug use, hard drugs, red meat, coffee. Everything went down. It was part of a whole lifestyle change, but it was restricted to more educated and wealthier sectors. In fact, I remember among the poor, it stayed sort of steady. Those changes didn't take place. Whatever the processes were that led to them didn't take place among the poor. You take a look where those trend lines were going. When they called the drug war, it's pretty clear what was going to happen. They were going to go after poor, black, Latino, and so on. And that was understood. There was one senator, Daniel Moynihan, who was a social scientist who paid attention to social statistics. And he stated at the time, right on the floor of the Senate, he said, look, if we call this drug war, now we are declaring a crime wave among minorities. And that's correct. And that's what they did, and that's why they did it. And in fact, that's the whole history of Prohibition is like this. Prohibition is very typically, for centuries, going after what are called the dangerous classes. The people you want to control, you're afraid of, you want to control. I mean, the poor, the black, or whatever. In fact, I heard a speech by the major legal historian of Prohibition, wrote the main book on marijuana, about 15 years ago. He was giving a speech to the Judges Association of California, and he went through the history of Prohibition. He predicted then that tobacco was going to be criminalized. It was going to be criminalized because if you look at the way the trend lines were going, it was being used more and more by poor people. And as it became localized among the poor, it would get criminalized. And that's just what's happening. In Massachusetts, for example, it's effectively criminalized. And one way or another, that's spreading around the country. And the drugs are the same. You criminalize things that the dangerous classes are doing, and it's a way of keeping them under control. And that's the main reason why the black population in jail is going out of sight. It's a real, it's a horror story for the populations. It's devastating to the communities. It's devastating for their future. And there's no reason why children in school shouldn't know what every criminologist writes about this.
Thanks a lot for speaking with us today, Mr. Chomsky. You've been a great inspiration. Right now, I'm working on a documentary addressing some issues around media consolidation, i.e. the 1996 Telecommunications Act, things like that were passed on June 2nd of this year. We're addressing the effects of media consolidation on local music cultures, but we're also drawing the implications to our democracy. And I'm wondering if you'd like to comment a little bit about media consolidation and these things.
Well, the best, I don't know anything about the music business, so I'm sure it's the same.
That's fine.
I just live in a different universe. But as for the news media, those, the press, television, so on, there is a good, steady record of consolidation that's published every couple of years. It's a book called The Media Monopoly by Ben Bagdikian, who was a long record, history in the media. He was head of the journalism school at Berkeley for a long time, Berkeley, California. And what he shows, if you take a look at the successive editions of the book, it's pretty dramatic. I think the first edition, back around early 80s, there were roughly 50 major centers of control for the national media. The last edition, I think it was down to about 8 or something like that. Furthermore, it's getting internationalized so that bookstores, newspapers, and so on are owned by international conglomerates. A lot of them are owned in Germany, places like that. So yes, there's a very narrow, there's a sharp narrowing of alternatives available. Michael Powell has been, Federal Communications Commission has been trying to reduce it still further. There's a battle going on in Congress about this. And the effects are, again, you don't have to be a genius to figure out the effects. The more consolidation there is, the less variety and opportunity there is. And that's the point of it, in fact. How much effect it has on the media product is another question. And it's not so obvious, because even when you have competing media, which are major corporations, linked to one another and to the state, they're going to say more or less the same thing, even if they're somewhat competing with one another. So when you have a corporate media system, the variety is going to be pretty narrow. If you look back in American history or British history, let's take just New England, this area where we live. You go back to, say, the 1850s, early Industrial Revolution. There was a very lively and active working class press, press based in the working class and in ethnic communities all over New England, all the places where the Industrial Revolution was going on, like Lowell and Lawrence. There was a really exciting working class press written by and run by the people there. Young women who were taken off the farms, who were called factory girls, Irish, artisans from Boston, whatever they were. And that was that's probably the period of the freest press in the history of the country. It gradually, the same in England. The period of greatest freedom of the press and variety of the press in England was around the same time, mid-19th century. In England, there were significant efforts to try to block it by taxation, by censorship, by state control, and so on. None of them worked. There's too many ways to evade it. But it was finally understood that the way to do it is by capital concentration and advertiser reliance. So if you have concentration of capital and funding by advertisers, over time, it's going to turn out that the media are run by the business world. Okay, obviously. They're the ones who can concentrate the capital, they can have the glitz and this, that, and the other thing, and they'll be funded by advertisers. Advertisers aren't going to fund a working class newspaper that's calling for workers to take over plants, as they were doing in Lowell and Lawrence 150 years ago. But they will fund newspapers that are trying to marginalize people and suppress their independence and make them passive and so on and so forth, and believe the right things. And over time, that's what happens. In England, it took until the 1960s. Till the 1960s, the biggest newspaper in England, which actually had larger circulation than all the major papers combined, was the Daily Herald. And it also had a lot of